Hello everyone, and welcome to this public session on the fringe, which is a popular word in Edinburgh these days, of the CES conference. My name is Per Johansson. I am the head of office of the European Parliament office in Edinburgh. And we in the European Parliament office work with the MEPs, like Catherine over here, to highlight the work that they are doing for you, their constituents, in Brussels and in the European Parliament. We do that by liaising with governments, with other public institutions, but also by organizing public events like this one that you're at today. I also want to say a special welcome to our audience on the internet. For this event will be live streamed, and if you are not happy with your face or your picture being transmitted, then now is the time to leave, basically. Exactly. Please don't. I also, unfortunately, have an apology to make today, and that is from Matt Carthy, MEP, who unfortunately, due to urgent constituency business, could not make it here today. But we have drafted in, off the bench, this young man, Francis Jacobs, who's replacing him and who will be doing a good job. He'll be introduced by Kirsty later on, basically. I also want to say a couple of thank yous. I want to thank Glasgow University, I want to thank CES, and I want to thank Eamon Butler, particularly for co-organizing this event with us and letting us do it here, basically. I also want to thank my colleagues Eddie and Marina, who have been instrumental in organizing this event today. And I would also like to invite you all to be part of the discussion and to use the hashtag #EPOnBrexit when you do so we all collect our social media entries in one space. But with that, and without further ado, I'll hand you over to your moderator today, Kirsty Hughes.
Thanks very much, Per, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to be here, and big thanks to the European Parliament, to Per and his colleagues for organising so well this wonderful event, which I hope is going to be really interesting. And we have a good amount of time, I'm glad to say, both to listen to our speakers and then to interact with them. I'm the director of a new Scottish EU think tank. It's called the Scottish Centre on European Relations. We established ourselves in March, just before the UK government submitted its Article 50 letter. And I think we can all agree that in that lovely English word, Brexit is getting more and more interesting each day, whatever our point of view. And of course, yesterday with the repeal bill, we saw the Welsh and Scottish governments coming out and saying they thought the draft bill was essentially not acceptable in its current form. Well, today we're going to talk about borders in a post-Brexit Europe. We've got speakers from Northern Ireland, Ireland, Wales, Scotland. Did I miss one? Hope not. To discuss that with us. And I think I was trying to do a list when I think about borders in a post-Brexit UK. We've got used to the fact that there's a real challenge, and we're going to hear more about the Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland border. But of course, as soon as you think about that, you've got to think about Irish Sea borders. We've had the Scottish Government's proposal for Scotland potentially to stay in the single market and in the UK, or equally at some point to become independent in the EU. That would mean land border of what sort with England. You've also, though, got to think about the UK's sea and air borders, which already exist with the rest of the EU. We were never in the Schengen passport-free zone, but those borders, I think, are to some extent going to get harder. How much harder is the subject of current big debate. But my personal view is that they're certainly not going to be frictionless. And also, once we think about borders, of course, we have to not just think about, is there a customs post like there used to be? I always remember that from going to the rest of Europe as a kid. But how does that vary for people, for goods, for services, agriculture, capital? So there's maybe multiple barriers and multiple types of borders. And the type of Brexit deal we get or don't get is going to impact on all of that. So that's just a couple of brief thoughts from me. I'm going to try and mostly be a good moderator and not drop my own opinions into this beyond that. Let me introduce all the panel to you, and then we'll hear them in turn, and then have time for questions and comments and discussion after that. Each of the speakers has been asked to speak for up to 10 minutes, and so I will gently prompt them should they stray too much towards the 15-minute mark, but hopefully some of them have already told me that they're very good, well-behaved panelists, so hopefully that's true. They're certainly all very distinguished anyway. So on my far left, Catherine Styler is a Labour MEP. She was elected in 1999 to the European Parliament and is currently Vice Chair of the Internal Market and Consumer Protection Committee. She's also a substitute. All the Parliament committees have so-called substitutes, and they play an important role too on some committees on the very powerful and important Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee. She has been Deputy Leader of the European Parliamentary Labour Party, and she's been European Parliamentary Labour Party Health Spokesperson, amongst many other roles. So welcome to Catherine. Then Dr. Alistair Allen, MSP, as I'm sure you know, is the Scottish Government Minister for International Development and Europe. He's been an MSP since May 2007, representing the constituency of the Western Isles. In terms of his, apart from all his professional achievements in politics, I have here that outside of politics, Alistair sings with the Back District Gaelic Choir in Lewis and has competed in the national mod. So that sounds very, very impressive from someone who can't really sing, talking about myself. To my left is Mark Drakeford, who's the Welsh Government Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government. So we're very grateful to you for making the effort to travel and join us here today. He became the Assembly Member for Cardiff West in May 2011. He was appointed Minister for Health and Social Services in March 2013, and just over a year ago he became the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government. On my far right, Dr. Katie Hayward is joining us from Queen's University, Belfast. She's a political sociologist with a focus in particular on conflict and post-conflict transitions. She's a senior lecturer in sociology at Queen's University, and she's a senior research fellow as well in the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice. And if that wasn't busy enough, she's also on the board of Conciliation Resources, the Centre for Cross-Border Studies, very helpful for today, and the Institute for Conflict Research. So welcome to Katie too. Last and not least, on my immediate right, Francis Jacobs, who has kindly stepped in, as Per explained. He was the head of the European Parliament Information Office in Ireland for a decade, from 2006 to 2016. And he's worked with the European Parliament since just before the first elections to it in 1979, so certainly a voice of experience and great wisdom there. And amongst other roles, he was head of unit for the European Parliament Committee on Environment, Public Health and Food Safety, as well as being a prolific author. So welcome to all the panel. We are very lucky, I think, to have such an expert and distinguished panel from across the UK today. No more further ado from me. I'm going to ask Catherine Styler to speak first.
Thank you very much to our chair, and yes, it's great to be in such a distinguished panel. I don't think, and Francis, when I was in the Environment Committee in 1999, and Francis was the key civil servant working on that committee, and who was very supportive of a new MEP starting out, Francis, and I'll always remember your kindness. Never did I think I'd be sitting in a panel with you, Francis, talking about borders in a post-Brexit Europe 18 years on. But you know, these times are a-changing, although I did put down in my speech that I was going to quote Joni Mitchell, "You don't know what you've got till it's gone," that they paved paradise and put up a parking lot. Now, the EU is not paradise, as we all know, but it is a necessity, and there are just so many paradoxes. As our chair said, when I serve as Vice Chair of the Single Market Committee, We are discussing in-depthly the digital single market strategy. I've worked on copyright reform. We're trying to get rid of borders, get rid of barriers. And here we are today thinking about creating barriers and borders that haven't existed for, at least certainly in the UK's context, for 43 years. And it reminds me of a poem by Robert Frost. And I keep going back to this Robert Frost poem, Mending Wall, where, and I quote, he only says, "Good fences make good neighbours. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head, why do they make good neighbours? Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offence." And I kind of think about this poem in the terms of the tragedy, which is Brexit, that we are building walls by putting in place these borders without knowing how much we will be walling out or how it will affect our neighbours and our relationships with them. Obviously, the most obvious border that is thrown into question by Brexit is the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And I know, Katie, there are people here today who are going to speak at Ireland who are specialists, and France as well, so I won't step on their toes by making Ireland the focus of my talk. But the UK and Irish governments, along with Michel Barnier and his team, have recognised the importance of protecting the Good Friday Agreement in the Brexit negotiations and preventing any hardening of an Irish land border. Sufficient progress will need to be made towards finding flexible and imaginative solutions to the issues on the island of Ireland before negotiations can move on. And there's no doubt about the significance of these problems. We all know, as the EU negotiator has said, there are three issues that have to be looked at. Firstly, citizens, and it's a citizenship-first approach, as the EU 27 have outlined. It is about the divorce bill, how much it is to leave the EU, and that settlement and that financial cost. And then it is about Ireland and Northern Ireland and what happens about, and until these three issues are resolved, there can be no further progress. And at the moment, as we all know, certainly from the UK's perspective, looking at what the UK is doing, it doesn't seem to be taking seriously some of these really important issues. But I wanted to focus on two issues, one that was raised this week at Westminster Hall debate, Euratom, and also the Customs Union. So while negotiations on the future of Euratom membership for the UK were the subject of this debate at Westminster Hall this week, the UK government, well, it seems to be in a little bit of a confused position because it made clear that they consider leaving the EU to include withdrawing from Euratom, but then we hear about what the Brexit minister is saying about some sort of semi-membership of Euratom. And so let's look at what is being said at the moment about if you withdraw from Euratom, thereby creating another border between ourselves and the rest of the EU, a border in the trade of nuclear materials and a border in our participation in nuclear research and making progress in the industry. Once again, the more we find out about implications of Brexit, the worse things get for the UK. Even cancer specialists saying there might not be enough radiation therapy available if we're not part of this organisation. So by building this specific wall with the EU, we are willfully excluding ourselves from a community which enables us to be at the forefront of nuclear research, to have a secure and reliable supply of nuclear materials and provide us with the safeguarding of our nuclear industry as well. And if the government does not put in place sufficient other measures before we leave, which seems unlikely in the time frame required, we could face job losses and risks to our energy supply. And that's just one aspect, one agency, one issue. Then if we look at the customs union, the issue of nuclear energy industry echoes the huge wall we would build for ourselves if we leave the customs union. The current rhetoric implies that this will be the case, as shown last week when Michel Barnier's speech to the ECOSOC committee said the UK will become a third country at the end of 29. This implies leaving the single market and leaving the customs union. And if we do leave the customs union, no one knows what this will look like, other than it will be damaging to the UK economy. And it's hard to know how the UK would even implement a customs regime in time, due to the amount of infrastructure and staffing that would have to be put in place at our borders. And these custom checks will add significantly to costs for British businesses, with some estimates putting the added cost to UK-EU trade at several £billion a year. In fact, a conversation I had on Tuesday night with, there was some debate happening in a think tank on issues around customs. And talking to the individual that was part of that debate, they're saying that each business would have to employ 2 additional people just to deal with the bureaucracy of customs. Each business, 2 people just to deal with customs. So a customs regime would also make it nearly impossible to continue to produce products that we have until now crossed in and out of the UK many times during the manufacturing process. Putting in place a customs regime will not only damage British business, but returning briefly to Ireland, will add large costs to the businesses too, with much of Ireland's exports to the EU currently travelling through the UK. And it's fair to say that the consequences of this wall would not make us a good neighbour. These 2 examples, just of Euratom and the Customs Union, others will talk more about other issues, just touch on the complexity of the issues thrown up by the borders created by Brexit and the extent to which we do not know the shape leaving the EU will take. So, and I know we're time short, so I'll come to a conclusion. I've worked in the European Parliament for 18 years, and I've been watching, since last year, our influence ebb away, the confusion that's created because we don't seem to have a plan as the UK. And now the rhetoric in Brussels is very much EU 27. And as somebody who really values their EU citizenship, really values, I was born in 1973, so I've only lived having EU citizenship, to then recognise that when you talk about the EU 27, you're no longer part of that picture. You're no longer you're losing that part of your identity. It's a very, very painful thing. So, as I mentioned at the start, the deal we have already is the best we can get. And so, the fewer walls we can build with the rest of the EU, the better. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Catherine, and I think we're going to build up this really dense picture soon from energy to cancer treatment to identity. These are all issues we've actually really got to think about. It's a reality, not a theory. I'm going on to our next speaker. I'm going to invite Mark Drayford to speak next and give us the Welsh point of view.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. What I thought I would do is just very briefly provide a small couple of minutes of context for people who will be less familiar with the Welsh experience in relation to Brexit. And then I'm going to talk about borders, as the theme suggests, and I'm going to talk about 4 different sorts of borders. And I'll come to those in a minute. So, just so that people are aware, in the run-up to the referendum in June of last year, the advice of the Welsh Government to people in Wales was entirely unambiguous. We argued throughout that the future of people in Wales would be best protected and promoted by continued membership of the European Union. And as you will know, we failed to persuade a sufficient number of our fellow citizens of the position that we had taken. The result in Wales is full of paradoxes, as it is everywhere else. Those parts of Wales which benefited the most from membership of the European Union were the most likely to vote to leave. Those places with the largest number of citizens from other parts of the world living in their midst were the most likely to vote to stay. In the end, the vote in Wales was very similar indeed to the vote across the whole of the United Kingdom. And as a result, the political position for those of us in Wales who argued to remain has some complexities in it, and the Welsh Government's position ever since has had to be that we are not focused on the fact of leaving the European Union. That is a decision taken in June of last year. We are focused on the form of Brexit and trying to make sure that the way in which we extract ourselves from the European Union does the least damage. I share Catherine's view that nothing will be as good as what we have now in many of these ways. But there are ways you can leave in which harm will be exaggerated and fundamental harm will be done to essential Welsh interests. And there may be some ways in which you can leave in which that harm is mitigated. And our focus throughout has been on trying to persuade the UK government to go about the Article 50 negotiations in a way that does us the least harm. So I'm going to talk about borders in 4 different ways. Very briefly, I'm going to talk about trade borders in the way that Catherine has. I'm going to talk about people borders. I'm going to talk about temporal borders, because the clock is ticking. And I'm going to talk about constitutional borders as well. So very briefly, in relation to trade borders, the Welsh Government's position has been from the very beginning that the most important priority from a Welsh perspective in the EU negotiations is to sustain free, full, unfettered participation in the single market and to continue membership of the customs union as well, at least for a period beyond the EU. And we do that because Welsh jobs and Welsh industries depend crucially on borders that are frictionless in that way. Borders that are free of tariffs, free of non-tariff barriers, and have regulatory equivalence. 2/3 of Welsh exports go to the European Union. And we take the view that for all the brave talk you will hear in some places about striking trade deals in other parts of the world, there is an iron law in trade, which is that trade halves as distance doubles. In other words, your nearest neighbours are always likely to be the people with whom you will have the richest trading relationships. And giving up free access to the market that we currently have, we believe, will be very damaging to a range of Welsh industries. Wales has a higher proportion of manufacturing industry than the rest of the United Kingdom, and component parts of cars that are made by Ford in Bridgend and Valencia in Spain, or by Airbus in North Wales and Toulouse in France, cross that border all the time, back and forth. And if every time they move they acquire an extra cost through a tariff, it's not that Ford will pull out of Bridgend in one go, but when very competitive decisions are being made as to where to put investment in the future, then the playing field will have been very significantly rigged against us. And we have very high levels of agriculture, fresh produce trade with the European Union, when non-tariff barriers will be very important. If your fresh produce is kept in a hangar outside a customs port for 3 days while forms are filled in, then by the time it gets past the customs post, it won't be a fresh product anymore. And there are whole swathes of Welsh economic activity in the agriculture field that if we don't end up with a sensible border in relation to trade, then those industries will simply not have a future of the sort that they've been able to enjoy hitherto. So we align ourselves as best we can with those voices in the UK government that argue that obtaining an economic deal as part of the Brexit negotiation should be the primary aim in the negotiations, and that certainly it should be put higher up the list of priorities than issues to do with borders. So that brings me to my second set of borders, people borders, free movement of people. And here, the Welsh Government has tried to set out a series of what we believe to be pragmatic ideas, which would not be so very far from the way in which many European countries already calibrate free movement of people in their own contexts, and which would allow a deal to be done with the European Union that would prevent the enormous damage that will be done to Welsh public services and Welsh industries if we are unable to attract people from other parts of the world to come and live and work in Wales. So we always say we do not tolerate the fact that people come from elsewhere to live in Wales. We absolutely celebrate the fact. We say how lucky we are that there are people from other places who are willing to come and make their futures part of our future. And barriers that we put in the place of that will be damaging directly in our public services. Our health service relies on the ability to recruit from other EU countries. Our social care services depend on people who come from elsewhere, but whole swathes of industry does as well. So it is in the interest of Welsh workers that we are able to attract people from elsewhere, because indigenous Welsh workers' jobs depend upon our ability to go on doing that. And we have a set of practical ideas, a greater emphasis on movement of people to work, and a greater emphasis on making sure that there are a series of practical rights for people at the entry level of jobs into the economy, and who fear that free movement of people has too often become a freedom to exploit other people, brought across borders from far away by unscrupulous employers who manipulate the rules that are meant to apply in the UK context, and in doing so have an impact upon the economic opportunities of others who operate in the same part of the economic market. So we have some very important things, we think, to say on people borders. Temporal borders, well, Article 50 was triggered. I think it's a mystery to many of us as to why it was triggered when it was, because it seems absolutely incontrovertible that as every day goes by, power shifts across the table, moves from the hands of the UK and into the hands of those who, as Catherine said, are charged with, understandably are charged with, thinking about and promoting the interests of the remaining 27. So we have, from the very beginning, put a major emphasis on transition arrangements. The UK government, at the first meeting that I attended when we put forward this idea, was not interested in transitional arrangements at all. The Secretary of State for exiting the European Union said there, as he said publicly at the time, that he was going to be able to agree the terms of the divorce and settle everything else that would follow after it within the 2-year period. And talk of transitional arrangements was a distraction from his ability to be able to do the deal that he was confident that he could do. I don't think he talks in that way anymore. From our point of view, a set of transitional arrangements that extend well beyond the 2-year period of Article 15 negotiations, and in which arrangements on the day after we leave the European Union should look as close as they can to the day before we left, so that industries and businesses and individuals have a chance to accommodate themselves to the way that the future will be created. Finally, to constitutional borders. Constitutional borders of all sorts, I think, will be very important, but I will, just for the moment, concentrate on devolution borders. The UK government will have to be brought to an understanding that the United Kingdom that will be here after we leave the European Union is not the United Kingdom that was there before we entered it. And that a simple recreation of a unitary state in which power is hugged to the centre and on a grace and favour basis eked out to other parts of the United Kingdom, that is not a plausible account of what the future of the United Kingdom can look like. Unfortunately, the withdrawal bill that was published yesterday appears to be straight out of that school of thinking. Constitutional responsibilities for agriculture, for fisheries, for environment and so on, which have been located in Cardiff, in Edinburgh and Belfast since 1999, since the very first weeks of devolution, and which we have chosen to exercise through our membership of the European Union. When the European Union is no longer there, those responsibilities have not gone anywhere. They will be where they have been all along. They will still be in Cardiff and Edinburgh and Belfast. And as a Welsh Government, we say we absolutely understand the need for UK single markets and to make sure that trade can be sensibly organised across the United Kingdom, and we would come to the table to repool some of these responsibilities in an agreed way. What the withdrawal bill does is not to seek agreement, not to proceed by recognising where responsibilities lie, but to say that they will be taken back. They'll be taken back to the centre. And then the UK government will decide how those things are to be organised in future, and then they will be handed back against a timetable that they can't declare and to an extent that they're not prepared to discuss to devolved administrations in the future. So I've said very directly to the Secretary of State, this is a government that needs friends. It's short of friends, and it's baffling that it should go about some of these fundamental devolution constitutional border matters in a way that appears to be looking to make opponents of people who would be very willing to come around the table with them in that voluntaristic way. So, unfortunately, and we don't look for this at all. We wish we could focus entirely on getting the job of Brexit done in the best possible way and with a government that was prepared to respect the devolution settlement as we have known it now for nearly 20 years. But if we don't have respect for that, there will inevitably be a fight on these constitutional borders as well. And if the UK government is looking for a fight, then my message to them, unfortunately, has to be they'll certainly find that they will get one.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. That's very clear, very stark. I'm very conscious the more I listen and the more I look into this at how interdependent all these issues are. I was talking to someone in Brussels, close to the negotiations, the day before the general election, and I asked that person about the linkage between the UK agricultural policy. Would Brussels need to know that to negotiate a trade deal with us? And the answer was, well, yes, certainly, of course. But we've only got as far as the repeal bill. There's going to be a fight about that. But what about the agricultural bill and the fisheries bill? And how long is that going to take? So, I mean, the UK government has dropped its demand to talk about trade straight away. But when you listen to the detail and the different political views on this, I think you have to keep asking, when will the UK have finalised it? When is it going to be in a position? How does that fit with the temporal borders? I like that phrase. I haven't heard it before, so I shall remember it and borrow it. Moving on, it's now the time to welcome Alistair Allen very much to give us his views.
Well, thank you very much. I heard that earlier today you'd been, this very intense academic discussion about the issues that are before us, and that now you had some light relief because you had some politicians talking very general terms. I was joking with Per earlier on, the pair of us were joking that while politicians are often accused of painting with broad brushes, that in the case of Brexit, industrial-sized roller paint might be required. I say that by way not of apology, but just by way of recognition of the situation that we're all in, which is feeling a lack of information coming from the UK government about what their intentions are. And we feel that in every aspect, not just of the political spectrum, but in the daily lives of people who are citizens of other EU countries resident in the UK. It's evident at our business, it's evident in every aspect of our national life, and it's a real danger, a real and present danger for many people that we have to seek to overcome that gap in the information that exists. I just want to make a few observations. Speakers so far have both used the word paradox, and I think it's a good way to begin looking at the situation we're in. Scotland is, of course, in a particular paradox when we consider the conflict of mandates that now exists, and the fact that the people of Scotland voted very clearly, 62% of them, to stay in the European Union. That's our starting place, and people are familiar with it, the political debate around this. But I think one thing that's very useful, amongst many others, that the Council for European Studies are doing here is allowing us to think about perhaps some of the wider issues as well, for instance, around not just the political predicament, but the practical consequences as well. Now, people are, of course, familiar with, as I say, where Scotland starts from this and the Scottish Government's position. But I want to say something about the efforts that we have made, and I'll keep it brief, but the efforts that we have made to try and find compromise and to try and find a way through this. Our paper, Scotland's Place in Europe, was an effort and remains an effort to try to find a way through this that will allow Scotland to maintain a connection with the single market, to maintain the freedom of movement of people, both of which, from the Scottish Government's point of view and from, I think, the point of view of wider society in Scotland, are just central to and essential to our economy. We've benefited, as Mark has said, of Wales culturally and socially, but also economically from people who've done us the honour of making Scotland their home. Now, the limiting of freedom of movement has the potential to create, as Catherine said, the building of walls, a potential to seriously harm Scotland's long-term economic development. Also our demographic development. People are aware of the fact that our population, and our working age population in particular in Scotland, is only growing because of our openness to people from other European countries living here. There are 181,000 non-UK EU nationals living in Scotland, and much of my time since the Brexit vote has been spent seeking as much as I can, with the limited information I have, to reassure those groups about what lies ahead for them. And I think it is worth putting on the record that, welcome as the UK Government's cursory efforts are to explain the future as it will expand for people in that situation, it is entirely unacceptable that anybody should be left for a year with no idea whatsoever about what their future is in this country, and without the most basic information even about their right to residency. In terms of post-Brexit migration, the UK position is, you won't be surprised to hear me say, at present unclear. And it's certainly now vital that clearer rules are put in place for future EU migration, including for EU nationals who arrive after the unspecified cut-off date. And that is something that we really need information on. The Scottish Government, their other contribution to this, of course, in that context, has been to talk about the potential for greater flexibilities on immigration. And I'm not talking here specifically about the situation of independence. I'm talking about the fact that countries like Canada, for instance, recognise that different parts of the country have different needs on immigration, and that we should start, and we have attempted to get the UK Government to listen to the fact that Scotland genuinely has different immigration needs, and we want to start making that much more clear and evident in the powers that are available to us. Trade boundaries are, of course, perhaps the most obvious barriers that we potentially face. 43% of Scotland's total international exports are to the EU. Businesses speaking out in Scotland, I hope it continues to speak out across the UK about the real threat that's posed by leaving the single market. And I think it's worth saying, given that, as has been mentioned, my constituency is a fishing constituency with plenty of fishermen in it, although there's no disguising the fact that my friends and constituents who are fishermen voted pretty overwhelmingly to leave the EU. It's interesting that a number of them have since come up to me and said, I didn't realise we were leaving the single market too, which probably tells us something interesting about that, particularly for those on the west coast of Scotland who see France and Spain as very important export markets. I think I have an internal body clock that probably makes me stop at about 7 minutes, because in the Scottish Parliament you get your microphone switched off at that point.
They didn't give me that button.
I'm not sure if I've yet. I'm not sure if I've yet reached it.
No, you've got plenty of time.
I would just like to conclude in that case by also mentioning a bit about the bill and the repeal bill, and I think we've certainly dropped the grate now in that. But I think when we talk about the repeal bill, and Mark has set out very clearly some of the concerns that both the Welsh and Scottish governments have in this area, they form part of a wider area of concern that both the Welsh and Scottish governments have expressed about the extent to which the devolved administrations have been involved meaningfully in the whole Brexit process, the whole negotiation process. We do seek to, both of us seek to work constructively in the joint ministerial committees that exist. It would be fair to say, and we've expressed this publicly, that the quality of opportunity to influence decisions has been pretty limited. We've been frustrated about the amount of information and indeed, even in some cases, the amount of information about the agenda that has been provided to us. But we do take them seriously, and we do intend, when they meet, to make use of those joint ministerial committees in future. But as Mark has said very clearly, we cannot countenance a power grab. And I was mystified to hear the UK's Secretary of State for Scotland this morning talking about a power bonanza, I think the phrase was. I'm not sure what a power bonanza is. It sounds like a Japanese car or something like that. I'm not sure. But the power bonanza which awaits Scotland, we have yet to see a single example of a power which will be coming in Scotland's direction, given what's on the face of the bill. And Wales and Scotland do have real concerns, given that both of our countries had to argue long and hard for decades to get the kind of powers that we have at present. We're not volunteering to hand over powers over agriculture and fisheries and much else to the UK on the unspecified promise that at an unspecified period in the future we might get some of them back. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Alistair. That was great, and certainly within time. I was struck a little while back, a few months back. So a journalist in London was talking to me about a programme they were making on Scottish independence and in the face of Brexit ? And the producer said to me, "Oh well, because of course since day one, Nicola Sturgeon and her colleagues have been aiming at independence, haven't they?" And I said, "Well, you do know there was a 92-0 vote in the Scottish Parliament within a week of the Brexit vote saying we want to explore ways to stay in the EU and stay in the single market. So, of course, we can certainly debate what politicians say and what they really mean. That's part of being in a democracy. But I think that was a really important and very interesting moment. And when we hear about calls to be in or very close to the single market, I've heard from our speeches so far compromise, flexibility, but lack of information, paradoxes. I think whatever we think of Brexit, it's also terribly important to look at the democratic process by which this is being done, and I find it extremely concerning in terms of even what we've seen in the last 48 hours on the repeal bill. But moving on, our next speaker is Francis Jacobs, and we look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. I have to be very careful with time because I'm much more, I don't have the discipline that politicians are used to. I used to sit next to a chair and saying that the speaker had gone past their speaking time and hoping that the chair would be tough with the speaker. I'd also like very much to thank my former colleague, Per Johansson, for the invitation, and it's great to be on the same panel as Catherine said, to meet up again in talking about borders. I'm not representing anyone. I'm speaking in a personal capacity. I'm someone who lives in Dublin, but I've lived in 5 EU countries, and I feel very much that I'm a person of European identity, of Irish, British, and Italian background. Today I'm just going to concentrate on the Northern Ireland border, but just a brief reflection at the end on other borders as well. So I want to start by giving some examples showing some of the complexities of the Northern Ireland border, drawn from my own personal experience, but also my work experience in the European Parliament office in Dublin. Then look at some of the lessons and questions raising from that, and some of the possible options, and then just a couple of final general comments. Starting with the personal examples. The other day, I went over the border to Newry. And actually, from my house in Dublin, just behind my house, from the hill behind it, I can see the mountains of Northern Ireland on a clear day, just to show that even from Dublin, you can see how close those borders are. So I went up an hour and a quarter to Newry, and the first thing you do is you come in at the roundabout in Newry, is a huge sign protesting against Brexit, and then you go into the centre of Newry, and there's a big poster. I was so struck by it, I photographed it, saying, "No borders, no barriers, protest." And Newry, of course, voted, I don't know the exact figures for Newry, but I suspect it was 85 to 90% vote Remain. All the border areas of Northern Ireland were massively voting Remain. Northern Ireland as a whole was 56%, less than Scotland, but the areas which voted Leave were the areas furthest away from the border. These are intertwined borders, both for personal reasons and for work. I've often had to travel to Donegal from Dublin. Unless you make a big detour around, you have to go through Northern Ireland. And when I first started going to Donegal, I remember you had to go past barbed wire, soldiers, watchtowers, and there were very, very few border crossings. One of the great things of the peace process is that there are now something like 300 formal crossing points. It's very easy to cross the border. Couple of family examples as well. Stayed overnight in a guest house in Glasgow, and when in breakfast, the butter is Lakeland Dairies from Monaghan, and Cavan and Monaghan. And Lakeland Dairies used to be run by my late brother-in-law. And the interesting thing about Lakeland is that the milk they get from farmers comes almost equally from the Republic and from farmers in the north. Just show how difficult is it going to be to unravel that. Another relative of my wife is a sheep farmer in Donegal. They live right on the area of the border, an area which used to have a hell of a lot of smuggling backwards and forwards across the border, including across the border to get extra subsidies by cutting off ears and sewing them on again on the other side of the border. His daughter works in Derry, commutes. The family shop in Derry, Londonderry, as well as in Letterkenny. And they also go there for medical reasons. The big hospital in Derry is a key place for them. We've had, of course, a lot of European, when I was working in Dublin, we had a lot of delegations going over on the border areas to look at the way the peace and reconciliation process was working. So we saw the encouraging process, but we also saw the fragility of it as well. And one final personal example is Matt Carthy, who can't be with us today, represents the border area of Monaghan, but he's one of 3 Sinn Féin MEPs from the Republic of Ireland. But their delegation leader, Martina Anderson, is in the north. And Martina Anderson has only got an Irish passport, as she's entitled to under the Good Friday Agreement. And I had to send her all the documents as if she was an Irish MEP rather than a British MEP. And when her predecessor resigned, the normal tradition is that the head of the office of the in the country which the MEP represents their signature is countersigned by the head of the office in that country. She refused to do it in London. She wanted to do it in Dublin, so I had to do it in Dublin. Those are just a few very scattered examples showing the complexity of this border. It's a very long border. Monaghan in the Republic is surrounded by the north. Armagh in the north is surrounded by the Republic. And Donegal, the furthest north county in Ireland, but not in Northern Ireland, is almost entirely cut off from the rest of Ireland. It's only a tiny, tiny border which it shares with Sligo. So there is no real logic to this border apart from the original logic was to make sure that areas with too many Catholics in Ulster weren't included in the Northern Ireland state. So it's 500 kilometres long. It's a long border. It's got 40 border towns. There are houses with entrances and exits on both sides of the border, including a very famous paramilitary Republican figure in Armagh, who was able to escape because he had exits on both in the Republic and in the north. And there are, as I mentioned, 300 border crossings. A couple of other points about the complexity of the border. If you look at Catholic and Church of Ireland dioceses, many of them straddle the border. The Bishop of Belfast, Connor and Down, also includes, for instance, places on the other side of the border in the Republic, and there are several other dioceses straddling the border. Environment, of course, knows no borders, and the Water Framework Directive is based on trying to ensure environmental integrity of river management basins. Several of the Irish river management basins straddle the border, and you obviously have to work together. And the final thing has been alluded to by previous speakers, fish, maritime boundaries. Ireland has got massive maritime area, and it's going to be interesting to see after the end of the UK, after Brexit, and after the repudiation of the London Convention, which is maybe more local fishing, but sea boundaries are going to be complicated, not least because of the problem of rockall, which is contested by the UK, Ireland, as well as Denmark and Iceland. And that's not neutral. Rockall is tiny, but it'll have a big effect on who owns which fish where. Few questions. Firstly, you often hear the phrase, what is a seamless border? What is it exactly? What about the people like Martina Anderson, the 300,000, I think I'm right, Katie, Northern Ireland citizens who have only Irish passports, is that right?
More than that, I'd
Is
say
it even more?
It's 21%.
21% of the Northern Ireland population of about 1.6 million have exclusively Irish passports. What's going to happen to them after Brexit? What's going to happen to the common travel area? It was really brought home to me when one of the people arrested, not arrested, he was killed, but one of the people in the London Bridge incident turned out to have lived for a while in Ireland. What happens if there's an incident in the UK and it turns out that the perpetrator has crossed the border between Ireland and the Republic? The pressure for changing the regime, even if the will to have an easy border is there, but there'll be a lot of pressures if that happens. If border checks are required, where should they take place? Should they be at the actual border? Should they be inside Northern Ireland or the Republic or on a spot check basis? Or should they be between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom? That's what you might say, well, the DUP and the Unionists will never accept that. But they were forced to accept it by the British government between 1939, when the Common Travel Area was suspended. The border checks were between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. And it survived until 1952, when the Common Travel Area was fully instituted. The Unionists, who were in total power, no power sharing then, were in total control, but the British government said it's impracticable to have all the border checks. And obviously the threats to the peace process, I don't have time to go into that, but they're clearly there. And the final question, what about Irish imports and exports transiting through the UK? That's another border problem which is very important. If there are huge queues building up at Dover, at the moment the vast majority of Irish imports and exports go through the UK, go through Wales, go through especially, and then England. So what's going to happen there? Obviously infrastructure is going to have to be built up to facilitate exports directly from Ireland to France, but that's going to take time and be expensive. Briefly, some of the options. Obviously, the ideal solution is as close as possible to the single market or the customs union, but we'll see whether that's going to be, how that's going to play out. I would just concentrate, I'm not going to talk about that, but I will mention the importance, whatever happens, of continued close cooperation. Obviously political, the peace process has had, and North-South reconciliation has not only had the North-South strand, but also the East-West strand involving Wales and Scotland, and that's going to be very important to maintain. But other forms of cooperation have been hugely important on the environment, as I mentioned before, and health. Cross-border patients, a lot of people go for treatment in Northern Ireland from the Republic. The distances are short, and very often the hospitals are, it might be better in the north, but anyway, it's in both directions. Infrastructure. Donegal is one of the poorer, more cut-off parts of Ireland. To improve links between the rest of Ireland and Donegal, you need to go through Northern Ireland so there's real cooperation needed there. Obviously tourism. We worked on a lot of cross-border projects, including some which were Ireland, Northern Ireland and Scotland. The Sail Europe project, for example, and various others. And then finally, energy, where obviously the island of Ireland, energy interconnection is absolutely fundamental, as it's going to be in the future in other areas as well. The UK will also have to decide whether it opts in to EU agencies, but also programs and funding like Interreg and the Peace 4 process. That will be possible, whatever happens, I hope, because, for example, Italy and Switzerland have a lot of Interreg cooperation. So I hope that's possible, but it will be hugely important that that kind of funding continues. I have the most sensitive question of all I pose before my final comments is on the question of will this eventually lead to Irish unity? The answer in the short term is certainly not, but it's very interesting that the impact of Brexit and all these questions about the border has made people start to reflect on it. I don't go further than that. Obviously, there's been a reflex among unionists, understandably, in the north. And it's unlikely to happen in the short term. But there has been a great reluctance to even think about that issue in recent years. And I think one of the implications of Brexit has been to think that maybe sometime in the thing there needs to be discussion, maybe on a confederal basis where Northern Ireland within a unified Ireland would have at least as much autonomy as it does currently within the UK. But this is very speculative, but the fact that people are talking about it more, including people who've been very moderate, not just Sinn Féin, but also very moderate politicians in other Irish parties are beginning to reflect on the consequences of this. And my final point is prompted by the title of today's panel, Borders in a Post-Brexit Europe. Because, of course, the final point I'll make is that the border threat is particularly acute, obviously, within the UK and in Ireland. But in recent times, because of the migration crisis, we've seen a lot of threats to Schengen and to borders in other European countries. And we've seen horrible scenes on the Greece-Bulgaria border and Hungary with fences. And we've seen now in Italy, the Italians who've got a huge pressure at the moment coming from migrant ships which are loaded in Italy. No one else wants to take them. They come into Italy. And then the Austrians have said, well, we may have to have troops on the border with Italy and so on. So my final point is it's a reminder that mobility we've come to take cross-border mobility within the EU, we've taken it for granted, and it must be continuously defended, not just within Ireland, but within the EU as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francis. And I think your final point is obviously one for another panel, but it's also very, very well taken. And when we look at the complexity of just discussing borders across these islands, there's a related, bigger, wider discussion in the rest of Europe across the EU. Last but certainly not least, we're very much looking forward to hearing Katie Hayward's views.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. Thank you, Eamon and Per, for the invitation. And thank you all for your interest. Although I'm losing sleep over Brexit and the border, I never get tired of talking about it. I've become a very boring dinner party guest, and I'm looking forward very much to your questions and to the discussion afterwards. In my brief contribution, I'm going to look at the border and the wider issues about Brexit and Northern Ireland from two different perspectives, perspectives of key groups that are affected by it. One is Northern Ireland's 3 MEPs, and the other is grassroots, people who are in the border region who are going to be most profoundly affected by Brexit, and particularly if we have a hard border. Last week I was in Monaghan and Fermanagh conducting some focus group research on the implications of Brexit for the rural Irish central border region. An opening question that we used to get the discussion going was to ask participants to describe Brexit in 1 or 2 words. The overriding response was uncertainty. There is deep concern among men and women of various ages from counties on both sides of the border about the insecurity caused by the unknown. One woman, talking about the lack of specifics coming out from the UK or Irish governments, commented, "It just feels so uncertain that nobody knows." The focus groups also revealed a striking paradox, another paradox, in the experience of the contemporary Irish border, which makes it difficult to explain to others and to try and get across now why it's quite such a difficult issue to address. In a way, the border doesn't exist. Most people don't even think about crossing it. This is part of the success of the peace process, of course. Nevertheless, at the same time, the border is ever present. It's a mental strain and a lingering legacy. One young man described it thus: "Mentally, the border would wear you down. Everyone feels it. And the psychological impact of Brexit in its reawakening of the border is very dangerous." In the gap of knowledge about the future iteration of the Irish border, the worst fears and rumours arise. The focus groups talked a lot about the former border, the borders of the past, so to speak. Nobody romanticised it. The scars run deep, including in the relative lack of integration that we see in the border area. I want to bear these concerns and these people in mind in our discussions today, although the rest of my brief presentation will focus on 3 quite different individuals, Northern Ireland's 3 MEPs. In their absence, I thought it might be useful to set out a couple of points about their approach to Brexit and the way that that's affecting the debate and discourse in Northern Ireland at the moment. So to begin with the DUP, whom people are more familiar with now, more interested in, which is great. Diane Dodds. If Twitter chatter is to be believed, Dodds' office this week accidentally sent a travel booking request to the whole of the European Parliament, asking them to book a flight from Brussels to Belfast via London. This prompted a witty response from a Labour MEP, not Catherine, suggesting that Dodds was planning to collect the 1.5 billion in cash from Theresa May, because she couldn't trust it for a cheque. As an aside, the fact is that Northern Ireland's peripherality is revealed in Dodds' request in that there are no direct flights from Brussels to Belfast. As such, perhaps more embarrassment would have been caused to Diane were she requesting a direct flight from Brussels to Dublin instead, which is what most of us travelling from Northern Ireland would do. This encapsulates the tricky position of the DUP, the way that pragmatism can often be trumped by ideology. The same is true of Sinn Féin, of course. Both are parties which have a deep history and experience of being on the fringes, of being the outsider towards whom wary glances are cast. Now they are, of course, both insider-outsiders, and this is reflected in their very differing approaches to Brexit. Both parties feel confident in their positions, even if they are mocked elsewhere, as they are reassured by the support bases within Northern Ireland. And that relates to a whole other different issue about the foundation of peace and the constitution in Northern Ireland. Results from the most recent Northern Ireland Life and Times survey show that 74% of DUP voters voted to leave, including those in the border region. Only 7% of Leave voters in Northern Ireland would change their minds and vote the other way if it was to happen again. There is no pressure, therefore, from within the bulk of DUP support base to shift their position on Brexit. It's worth looking a little bit more closely on how this position has been articulated by Diane Dodds. Some months ago, there was a flutter of interest amongst some of us Brexperts at Queen's regarding comments made by Dodds at the DUP conference in December, when she made the statement, we should not forget that trade between East and West Germany was treated as internal by the EU. Her statement implies a willingness to consider cross-border trade north and south as being treated as internal to the EU, but is unwilling to accept that this is only possible within the single market. Leaving the single market and the customs union is, she states, the UK's golden opportunity to free local business from red tape. And similarly to the UK government's approach, it's that rationale that trumps the other. Secondly is the mantra, we joined as one country, we leave as one country. This is cherished by the DUP. And therefore, if people raise the issue of peace as a means of, as a foundation for special status for Northern Ireland, a classic response from Dodds would be, our peace was won by security forces and by our people, not by Brussels. And on funding, she acknowledges EU funding and indeed has been very helpful to her constituents in Northern Ireland in accessing EU funding. But she notes, we should not forget it was our money to begin with. As such, much of the DUP's stance depends on London coming good after Brexit in replacing EU funds for CAP, for peace, for Interreg, what have you. UK independence from the EU certainly does not mean less dependence for Northern Ireland on London. Finally, as MEP, Dodds has committed the DUP to making sure that our particular circumstances are well known in the European Parliament, and she's quite willing to bear the brunt of mockery from fellow MEPs in so doing. A different perspective on Northern Ireland's particular circumstances is put forward by Sinn Féin's Martina Anderson. Anderson, as Francis has noted, is motivated on behalf of the rights of Irish citizens in the north. So 89% of basically people born in Northern Ireland are entitled to hold Irish citizenship. She's keen to avoid the stark imposition of a very profound two-tier system of Irish citizenship on the island of Ireland after Brexit. An interesting question is, can agreement on the nature of these rights, who will guarantee and honour these rights of Irish citizens in Northern Ireland, how they match conditions of residency, etc., can this agreement be addressed within the next 5 days, which appears to be the new deadline for agreement on EU citizens' rights in the Brexit negotiations? Anderson, as Francis mentioned too, acts as leader of the Irish group of Sinn Féin MEPs in Brussels and Strasbourg. Perhaps the most significant contribution of this group recently was a resolution put forward before the Parliament last week from GUE Nordic Left. It called for the Good Friday Agreement to be fully upheld as part of the withdrawal agreement. So far, so good. But it also called for the north of Ireland to be designated with special status within the EU, maintaining access to the EU customs union and single market. It also included other points that were directly provocative to MEPs other than Dodds and Nicholson. This included the request that in order to reflect the fact that people of the north of Ireland are no longer counted in the British vote under qualified majority voting, the vote of the Dublin government in the Council of Ministers should be increased accordingly. Somewhat unsurprisingly, for various reasons, the motion was roundly defeated on the 5th of July by 374 votes to 66. Back in Ireland, Martina Anderson's support for the group Border Communities Against Brexit and her home base in the northwest city region of Derry, Strabane and Donegal means that she's able to bring very live concerns from a very integrated border region to Brussels and Strasbourg, and this has been vital, I think. Finally, the veteran MEP Jim Nicholson. He's a person worth considering because he embodies many of the difficulties of Northern Ireland's current position, not least among which is the moderate parties being drawn into the polarising effects of Brexit. The Ulster Unionist Party is in a very odd position. It came out for Remain, but as a critical friend, keen to see change in the European Union. But as it happens, about 55% or so of its supporters voted to leave. Nicholson's position has changed significantly since then, and it's notable that the UUP's manifesto was even more forceful than the DUP's on Brexit and on the issue of special status for Northern Ireland. I quote, "Whilst some parties believe hastily calling for special status is the perfect, all-encompassing response to the challenges of Brexit, the reality is it would be a major retrograde step for Northern Ireland. Any perception of special status would secure would be to simply put Northern Ireland on the fringes of the Union, meaning the United Kingdom. For such reasons, as you can imagine, Jim was not impressed by Sinn Féin's resolution to the European Parliament. His argument began from the point that there is no legal or political entity called the North of Ireland. And he later tweeted that MEPs from across the European Parliament now see through Sinn Féin's posturing. It's notable that the UUP want to present the European Parliament as a vicarious location for the ongoing battle with Republicans, or in the phrase beloved of some, with the pan-nationalist front. This is particular significance in light of the suspension of devolution and with the prospect of Brexit. There is a concern amongst unionists that Jim expresses well. People are using Brexit to break up the United Kingdom. It's not only Sinn Féin that they are suspicious of. Indeed, in a comment in the European Parliament last year, in the presence of Barnier, that could have been a direct quote from Ian Paisley, Jim Nicholson stated, "Dublin does not speak for Belfast. We will take care of ourselves." Jim is right in some ways. Northern Ireland will need to look after itself. Dublin's hands are quite tied. London is distracted, and the EU cannot counter the effects of the UK's decisions. The problem is that there are more profound reasons to doubt now whether Northern Ireland politicians have the capacity or the will to look after Northern Ireland. This was expressed very bluntly by a focus group in Enniskillen, and I will end on a quote from them. "I would love a group of people like us to sit down with our political leaders and to ask them how they expect us to have any confidence in what they are trying to do. I would like to know their justification for sticking their heads in the sand in Northern Ireland. We'd be naive to believe that someone will come back from Europe and say, here's the deal, be happy with that, and that people here will simply say, okay."
Thank you very much, Katie. I thought I was a Brexit expert, but I've now learned that I'm a Brexpert, and I'm very pleased to have learned that, but I think that means I'm obviously not one, because I hadn't heard it before. You just made it up. Copyright it. What a wonderful and very challenging range of presentations. I won't try and summarize it all, but some of the words I've been most struck by, and I sit in a lot of Brexit events, but lack of information, lack of consultation, fragility, polarization, uncertainty. I talked to a sort of very gently spoken diplomat a little while back from an EU 27 state who said to me, relations with the UK are not where they need to be to get any sort of reasonable deal out of it. And I think we've sort of picked up about relations within the UK and with Ireland, but I think we see some of that, or hear some of these same words and challenges in terms of what's going on UK to EU 27. So I think we're at an incredibly important and extremely difficult moment, but that's enough from me. I will gather up 2, 3, or even 4 questions at a time and then come back to our panel. I've got lots of hands already, and I think I've got 2 roving mics. So we'll start with the woman right at the back in the green top. The mic's coming to you, and if you could just say your name, if that's okay, that would be helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Kim Shepley from Princeton. One thing I'm hearing is, of course, and one thing the panel represents is there's actually nobody from the London government Tory party here, because they're not talking to anybody. And so I'm wondering whether what you see is coming, because yesterday, Michel Barnier met with the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales and with the leader of the Labour Party. It looks to me like both the EU and many of you here are sort of contemplating what happens when you've got, an alcoholic in the family that doesn't recognize their problem. When the whole family gets together and sort of plans an intervention to say that, this is not going well. So I'm wondering to what extent you're all talking to each other about that possibility.
Okay, that's a very good question. I think, could I just see the hands again? I think there was some, yes, so the gentleman next to you.
It was a few clarity questions.
And if you could give us your name?
My name's Martin Allen. It was a few clarity questions, and if I could start with the border. I mean, there was a border while we were in Europe between the Republic and Northern Ireland, and it was Westminster government and the peace process that removed that border, and it was a security border. It wasn't a customs border. I'm understanding also there's a historic free travel area between the Republic and the UK, and that was in place before Europe, and it will still be in place after Europe. So I'm kind of confused in some of the things that are said in terms of as if that's going to change, because it's not going to change. And in terms of, as Mark was saying about in Wales and the welcoming of other people coming, across borders to work, I've got no difficulty with that. I think you've got to accept a lot of people that have come in for Europe are coming to work for lower pay and lower conditions, or higher pay, because local people haven't had the education, or the investment hasn't been in the education so as they can take up the higher paid jobs. And I don't know whether it's a paradox, Alistair, when you discuss 62% of people voting to remain in the EU, when you don't accept that the majority of people in Scotland voted to stay in the UK, and it was in fact a UK vote. So I came along here today hoping to find something post-Brexit information, and really I'm just hearing the same things that have been discussed maybe a year ago, 2 years ago. Really no clarity, no solutions.
Okay.
It's somebody else's fault again.
Okay, thanks very much.
I'm leaving you out, Catherine.
That's okay. And you snuck in at least 3 questions there, so that's fine. But I encourage other people to stick, if possible, to one. We'll take another couple at the back, and then we'll come back to our panel. Don't worry, we have lots of time to fit people in.
Yeah, Tom Mullen from the University of Glasgow here. If there's a political objective to achieve as softer border as possible between Northern Ireland and Ireland, are there any useful lessons to be learned from Scandinavia, bearing in mind that all the nations are, well, that not all the nations are in the EU, Norway is only in the EEA. I'm particularly thinking of the arrangements that there might be working there for the movement of people and the movement of goods.
Okay, and yes, next to you, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Hi, my name is Andrew Starkham from the University of Cambridge, and my question is for the 3 elected officials on the panel, but in a different context. First, for the 2 gentlemen, it seems that both of your governments kind of have a 2-prong approach to Brexit, that one, you're going to Brussels, or your leaders are going to Brussels and trying to lobby there, but then there might be this battle about constitutional borders that was brought up. And just to put forward something that was in Dr. Hayward's panel this morning, what happens if everything just goes completely acrimonious? That the UK government just says, we can't move forward on these 3 preconditions. Where does your focus turn then? Does it turn to Westminster, or does it turn to Brussels? And in the same situation, Ms. Styler, what becomes your role as an MEP in the Parliament if that happens?
Okay, great, thank you. Some really great questions there. I'm going to ask Katie to start, if that's all right, especially with some of those Northern Ireland border questions, and come through the panel. Thanks.
So I'll start on the question of lessons from Scandinavia. So you're right, the issue of Norway, Sweden has come up quite a lot as an example. In relation to the movement of people, there's a Nordic Passport Union, which has since become part of the Schengen area, so the movement of people is dealt with by that. And in relation to the movement of goods, Norway is in the European Economic Area, so it's part of the single market. So again, this is what some people would like to happen from Northern Ireland's perspective, and of course Scotland and Wales as well, for those reasons, because it enables frictionless trade effectively. And even in the management, they do have to have some customs checks, and in the management of that, they're dealing with far fewer crossing points, just a handful. And the levels of trade are significantly less and not as complicated. They're not in agri-food, for example. So there are some lessons to be taken, but minimal ones. And on your questions about the border, there was a customs border, of course, between Ireland and Northern Ireland, and the customs posts were only removed in the early 90s as a result of membership of the single market. And the common travel area, it's really about, the common travel area only means that there won't be immigration checks on Irish and British citizens between these islands. It doesn't relate specifically to rights of other citizens within these islands. Freedom of movement as a European principle entails all sorts of other things. It's not just about not being checked for passports, etc. So the big issue then comes about, even if you're just talking about Irish and British citizens, what needs to happen is the formalisation of the recognition of, say, Irish citizens' rights in the UK, particularly in Britain, and similarly British citizens' rights within Ireland, and that needs to be processed through legislation on top of everything else. And so common travel area membership it helps, it's going to be recognised by the European Union, this bilateral arrangement, but it in no way begins to address the complicated issues in relation to rights and equal rights and parity of rights and non-discrimination that has come about through membership of the European Union.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask Mark to have a go at some of those questions next, not forgetting the very first one about Tories in the family.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll try and take the first and the last question,
fine.
and then a question of my own in relation to one of the ones in the middle. So do we talk to each other? Well, we try to talk to each other quite a lot. There's not an identity of position between Wales and Scotland, but there's a great deal of overlap, and we have tried our best during the whole of the post-Article 50 triggering period to work as closely together as we can on the things where we have common interests. We have latterly, I think, been frustrated in this by the failure of the formal mechanisms inside the United Kingdom to operate at all. Let me, in an ecumenical spirit for a minute, just say that I think the Prime Minister was to be congratulated on reviving the Joint Ministerial Committee mechanism quite soon after her appointment. It had been allowed to go into complete disuse by David Cameron, just about the most careless Prime Minister as far as the future of the United Kingdom is concerned. And when she became Prime Minister, one of the very early things that Theresa May did was to call a JMC of the First Ministers. She established the Joint Ministerial Committee on European Negotiation, and she gave it a very challenging set of terms of reference, an ambitious set of terms of reference. So I think you've got to say there was some effort there to make that intra-UK set of machinery operate. Unfortunately, in practice, it operated very poorly for a wide variety of reasons, and it hasn't met at all since February of this year. And despite a series of efforts between our two governments to get a JMC on European negotiation to meet again since the general election, we are in the further paradoxical position this month that the UK government is prepared to have a JMC on European negotiations with Gibraltar, but is not prepared to have one with Wales and Scotland. And of course the Northern Irish position does make that additionally complicated, but not in our view an insuperable difficulty. So what does that mean? And in the last question, if there's just a huge car crash here, if the UK government just decide that it's all too difficult and they're just going to walk away. Well, personally, I think the focus of action there will be not immediately in relation to devolved administrations, but will be in the House of Commons as elected in June this year, because in the way that some people put it, the general election does not change the physics of Brexit. Article 50 is still Article 50, the 2-year timetable is still the 2-year timetable, the Commission is still the Commission, all those sort of fixed points in it all are the same, but the chemistry of Brexit is very fundamentally altered by the general election. A combination of forces within the House of Commons and what that does in terms of emboldening the House of Lords is very different in a hung parliament than it was in a parliament where Mrs May anticipated, a majority of 150 in which she could steamroller her way home. So I imagine that if there is a point where the UK government says that it is walking away from the negotiations because it's all too difficult and they can't make any progress, there may be some very interesting moves in the House of Commons to find a government that is prepared to find a way through. So I think the action will be there. Can I ask my one question?
Yes, the Wales lower wages one? Another one.
I wanted to pick up the point because I'm also trying to learn a bit this afternoon, and I'm learning a lot. So the border issue inside Ireland, which seems to me so sort of, fundamentally difficult and so on. If there is a common travel area and an Italian citizen lands in Dublin, don't we have free movement of people as far as the United Kingdom is concerned? Because we have a land border now between the United Kingdom and Europe, as in the Republic, across which anybody can cross. So,
Okay, we'll add that to the list of questions. Are you going to give an answer to the gentleman on welcoming people into Wales, but have they lowered wages? And then I'll ask Alistair.
I try to say that in relation to people and borders, the two big things that we try and work on, and we will be publishing a paper as a government on this in the next few weeks, is on the one hand to try and explain and explore with people why continuing to welcome people to come and live and work in Wales is so important to our economy, but to try and respond to the concerns that people have at that point in the labour market, that freedom of movement had become freedom to exploit, by looking at things that we can, rights that people have, which have been eroded because people are employed on contracts that appear to give them the minimum wage, but where they are in tied accommodation, where they are, they pay rents which are way above the local market rents, or are required to buy goods. It's like the old truck shop system in some of these industries, and these are all just ways of undermining rights that are people ought to be entitled to. But we will suggest a new set of rights as well, to try and make sure that if people come to work in those sort of industries, they are not being exploited, and that exploitation doesn't have a distorting effect on the economic opportunities of other people who are also needing to find work in those relatively low-paid, relatively entry-level opportunities in the local economy.
Great, thank you. Alistair, would you like to pick up some of those next, please?
I'll try and pick up some. Kim's questions about relations with Europe. I won't comment on the analogies you used about family members, but in terms of the relationships that there are, I mean, I certainly think, as is clear, although we come from different political perspectives, that the Welsh and Scottish governments have a great deal of common ground on which they've been able to try and work together, and will do so in the future, I'm sure. I think it's important to try and indicate why I think we both feel a sense of frustration, though, about information, and this has been mentioned a couple of times. As a Europe Minister, or one of the Europe Ministers in the Scottish Government, I learned about the moving of Article 50 from Twitter. Now, for people who come from, and as I've had these conversations with people from Germany and other federal countries, they are slightly amazed to know that a constituted, devolved legislative assembly's government would have that kind of exchange of information with the UK government. So it is a real frustration. It's not a sense of being piqued, but it is very difficult for the Scottish government, and I'm sure the Welsh government, to have a proper engagement with the debate and the decisions around Brexit, if that is the level of information exchange, and we have to seek to improve on that. We do work through the joint ministerial committees, and I think we go into them with a very positive attitude of trying to shift things on. But it is important to make clear that is how we learned about the moving of Article 50. The gentleman who asked about the common travel area, I beg your pardon, I didn't catch your name, and I'm sure we're not going to agree on some things. But as has been mentioned, the common travel area, I think you're right to say it's not going to change, but it is very much about the rights of UK, Scottish, Isle of Man, Guernsey, Jersey citizens, rather than to do with the rights of citizens from other EU countries. The one thing I would say about it is that I can't imagine that the common travel area, given that it's long predated the EU, will or would change in the circumstances of independence. And to pick up on your point, we do accept the reality of the result of the 2014 election, referendum rather. We reserve the right to continue to make the case for independence as the best solution for Scotland. I don't see anything undemocratic in putting forward that debate, and I certainly don't see anything undemocratic about Scotland being given some kind of say at the end of the Brexit process as to what the way forward for Scotland is.
Okay, thank you. Francis, do you want to go next? Catherine, and then we'll come back for more questions.
I'll just be very quick because Katie mentioned most of her points. I just wanted to add, besides the Scandinavian countries, there is, of course, the Swiss example, where now you can cross the border between the EU and Switzerland. But the Swiss agreement is, or set of agreements, is incredibly complex and also at the moment very uncertain because it can always be challenged by referendum, and all the different bilateral agreements hang together, and if one of them is unpicked, the lot unpicked. So that would be a very unwise route probably for the UK to go. But at the moment it's true that you can go without border checks from the EU into Switzerland and back, although it's quite interesting that if you go to an Italian supermarket, you can see there are kind of things from the Swiss Customs Authority telling what your limit of the amount you purchased there is, but will not be subject to tax when you go back into Switzerland. So it's quite striking, even that relatively seamless border.
Okay, Catherine.
Maybe if I can continue what Franz was saying about the two aspects of the Norway example. Because of the EEA means you're not part of the customs union. So, for example, my assistant Vanessa is moving back to Oslo and has found, because she's got to transport, her dad was going to give her a lift but can't do that anymore, and her alcohol that she has to transport back to Oslo will be charged. Her and other aspects of what she's bringing back into Oslo. So I said, well, you just have to drink your Harris gin then. She has a bottle of Harris gin. So, but it was that aspect of you're charged. And then she told a story about a few years ago where there was a butter shortage in Oslo, well, in Norway, at Christmas time. So people couldn't buy butter. We're having to go to Sweden. Now, you've got to be careful because they're in charge, because it's a different agricultural product coming in. And it just so happened last week in The Guardian on Saturday, there was an article about butter shortages happening. I'm kind of looking at it going, could that possibly happen? That we too could experience a butter shortage like what happened in... And you start to think about those things, about charging, money, how much things coming in and out. And I think that's something, looking at what's happening in Norway, looking at customs is something I think is quite important. And to remember that EEA is you are not part of the customs union. You're part of the single market, but not part of the customs union. That's something to reflect upon. I think somebody asked me a question personally about what would happen if everything fell apart and what happens to British MEPs. Well, if all falls apart, then we're out before what Barney said of the end of March 2019. And I think that's the reality, that if things do fall apart, we leave earlier. And although we've got this, as you know what he said yesterday, that it's not whistles that he's listening to, but the clock is ticking. So, I mean, it's very, very serious. And I loved your analogy about the alcohol. I think that is a very interesting one. And maybe my Welsh and Scottish colleague can't say it, but I really cannot believe we don't have a transparent system in the UK, the same as what we're having at the European Union level. I mean, what is happening in the EU, you've got a 4-week cycle of the negotiation, and it's just really clear. Michel Barnier comes to the Parliament, comes to the ECOSOC committee, comes and discusses the issues, and is open and accessible. And yet we're grappling around to find position documents of the UK when next week the discussion is happening. Now, I think the 4-week cycle is a pragmatic example, and one which the UK government should adopt. And just simply, not just to consult the devolved nations, but also to consult citizens. Because, I mean, Michel Barnier came to the S&D group and simply said, we are putting, it's a citizens first agenda that we have, a citizens first agenda that EU27 have. Why are we not having the same approach at the UK level? And I just think it's extraordinary that we're in this unprecedented situation and we have very little transparency about what's happening in the UK.
Okay, great. And Katie, do you want to answer Mark's question about the Italian who lands in Dublin can come through to London or Edinburgh?
Yes, so they can do that at the moment because of EU membership. But already, if you cross the border and you don't have a visa for entering the other jurisdiction, then you can be stopped. So the Garda Síochána, for example, fairly regularly do sort of random spot checks on buses that are coming from Belfast down to Dublin. They don't do it on the border, but they do it just south of the border. So that already happens. If that answers your question. It's about sort of visas, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to, there's a gentleman been waiting patiently at the back for a long time, then I'll come to the lady in the row in front.
I'll continue the alcohol metaphor. Maybe David Mundell was on Donald Trump labelled whiskey, although he delivered his statement with a degree more literacy than the level of Donald Trump. The question really is this. My old lecturer, Tom Devine, about 3 or 4 months ago, he wrote an article in the Herald, the Glasgow Herald, saying he didn't think it was going to happen, or he certainly poured a lot of cold water, very sceptical of whether Brexit actually may occur. And I have to admit, in the last few months, and in the last few weeks in particular, I'm starting to take my old lecturer's position more and more seriously. And therefore, here's the question. Are there any discussions among institutions, particularly academic institutions, about route maps back, a sort of slingshot effect, if I may use an astronomical metaphor?
Okay, and then the lady in the next row down. So, thank you. Yeah, and if you could give us your name, thank you.
My name's Donna Curlis. And Catherine, you just said you wonder why we're not, doing what Michelle Barnier's doing and putting sort of a 4-week timetable on things. I did speak to an MEP who said that David Davis is one of the most incompetent people he has ever met. And also one of the panel, Mark, you've just said that David Cameron was very careless. So I'm beginning to wonder, are we in this position? Because rather than having a government that's reaching out, making friends and networking, which I'm sure we're all used to doing that, we have maybe a small circle of MPs who perhaps are viewed as quite arrogant to quite a lot of people, and therefore they're not doing any of those things which other people in society might take as a given. My question is, one, same as your question, will Brexit ever go ahead? I hope it won't. And the second one is, what about Scotland? Please, will Scotland keep trying to get independence and back in the EU? Because I think it's such a backward step to be coming out of the EU, especially for all the young people as well that have been able to benefit so much of travelling abroad, etc.
Okay, thank you very much. And then if we could come down the front. Gentleman here.
Hi, my name's David Brenner. I'm here from Glasgow. My question is, if this is a United Kingdom, why is nobody talking to Scotland, to Wales, to Ireland? Everything you're seeing, you've suggested that Theresa May was hoping to win the general election so that she could steamroll over everyone else. How is that a United Kingdom? And if that's something that they can't get right there, how on earth are they going to get negotiations right to vote out of the EU from their perceived perception of their own power, which seems to be extremely inaccurate?
Okay, and then I'm going to go gentleman at the back who's been waiting patiently. And there will be time for another round too, so yes, your name, sorry.
Thanks very much. My name's Bill Johnston. I'm a citizen, first and foremost, Scottish by birth, Irish by heritage, and that, I think, would entitle me to a passport one of these days, which might be helpful. I'm also 67 years of age, and if I live long enough, I might find out the answer to some of the questions up on that slide there, what will Europe be like? I'd like to have some say in what it's like before then, because I think there are issues that are specific to my age group and older people and people moving into that age group in their late 50s. And what I can't find is who has the locus for that generational take on Brexit. I hear stories about old people vote, old people need East European nurses in the care homes, and old people living in Spain might have problems with their pensions, etc. What I don't hear is a comprehensive account of what it might mean for me, and certainly nobody has ever asked me. And I'd like to hear from the panel, very simple question, who do you believe has the locus for that generational issue? And if you don't know who it is, could you suggest who it should be? Thank you.
Okay, that's a lovely set of questions, including a couple on might Brexit not happen, and if so, how not? So, Catherine, do you want to have a first stab at
on whether Brexit will happen? I mean, Article 50 is triggered, and it's up to the UK. I mean, the UK is triggered. This is our problem. I mean, business goes on as usual in the EU. I mean, this week the Internal Market Committee, we put stuff up on construction product regulation and fire safety. We looked at fertiliser, CE marking, all sorts of different issues. Issues keep going, legislation's looked upon. This is our issue, and it's up to us. If we want to stop it, it's up to us. But it is, you know, we have triggered Article 50. The process is there, and to me, somebody who doesn't want this to happen, I am very doubtful that you can stop this in terms of the politics of it. Unfortunately, it's not what I would choose. So, I mean, but things change, you know, and so what happens at this moment is 6 months, circumstances can change, things can happen. I always say that for me, the best option is to remain with what we have. If you are coming out, the second best option is having some sort of EEA-EFTA relationship. But remember, EEA means you're not in the customs union, you're in the single market, so there's complexity around that. But we need to find a way to keep within the single market and being part of the customs union as a bare minimum, because everything is suboptimal to what we have as full membership of the European Union, and we've lost influence. I just mentioned about putting on the agenda issues around fire safety. We will never be able to do that without having MEPs who can put that on the agenda when some constituents write to you and people are putting pressure because they want to know and have answers, and rightly so. But we're losing influence by being no longer a full member of the EU, and that's so sad to see that one word of influence no longer having influence as a large member state. So let's watch this space. In terms of what you said about the locus, about where to go to, I mean, we all have a locus in terms of dealing with issues around ageing, dealing with issues around, I mean, public health is not an EU competence, but we share best practice, we work together. And one of the biggest challenges, and I think you're touching on something really important, I mean, one of the biggest challenges we have as a society is our ageing population. And it was last Friday I was at a meeting where it was, you know, the issue about demography, the fact that we're now going to have less 15-year-olds in Scotland, the fact that we need migrate. These are big issues, and the issues around how we deal with those challenges, and with the context of Brexit as well, are ones that we all should take responsibility. So I'm not, I mean, in a way, it's all our responsibility, and it's your responsibility as well to work with us to try and find solutions. So, you know, lots to do, and, you know, regardless of whether Brexit is happening or not, the issue about ageing and how we deal with it in Scotland and the UK and across the world is a huge challenge.
Okay. Alistair, you've been asked about independence in the EU, but also, you know, you've commented on the government not talking to the Scottish government enough. How does that reflect on the ability of the UK government to talk to the EU 27 appropriately? If you could have a go at those two.
On the face of it, one can only hope that they're better at it with the EU 27 than they are with Scotland. I mean, I think, you know, without being flippant, I think we don't, in the Scottish Government, pretend that we're in a position to have parallel negotiations. We understand that this is a negotiation between the UK Government and the EU, but we'd like to be involved. We feel we have a moral right to have some involvement, to have some voice at the table, particularly given the difference that there was in the mandates between Scotland and the UK. But I think at a practical level, David Davis's name was mentioned by one of the questioners. I think one of the things that alarms not just the Scottish Government, but alarms business and society more generally in Scotland is the sense in which there are some voices, not all voices, but there are some voices raised within the UK Government who suggest that this is quite a simple business and it will all sort itself out, and that the other 27 really ultimately will want to come round to the UK Government's way of thinking. I just think from all the conversations I've had with governments and diplomats and others from the EU27, this view is simply scorned. This view is simply derided. And I think there needs to be a sense of reality in the way that the UK deals with the other 27, a sense of respect and a sense of understanding that really, if we expect to try and salvage some kind of good relationship with the EU27, we have to treat them with that respect and expect to be treated with respect in return.
And the Scotland aiming for independence in the EU?
Yeah, I think that, as I say, there's no secret about the fact that my party and the Scottish Government feels that the best solution for Scotland is a Scotland where we take our own decisions in the world, where we're an independent country. There's no secret about the fact that we are a pro-European party, and that's how we would choose to see our future. We feel that Scotland has been put in a situation that's not of our choosing. We're trying now to salvage from the situation what we can in terms of the single market, in terms of the free movement of people. But the First Minister has also said very clearly that at the end of this process, when everyone else in Europe will have some kind of say over the future, it would be very strange if people in Scotland didn't have a say over the future and a say at the end of the Brexit negotiations, and that means a referendum, as the First Minister has set out.
Right. And Mark, do you think, has anybody got a route map if we do change our minds? And just to extend the question on the impact on older people, there's an impact on middle-aged people, on younger people, on trained people, on, you know, the UK government, is it on top of all the impacts, do you think?
The real problem has always seemed to me that the idea that the UK government has a plan in the drawer and that it isn't sharing it with Wales and Scotland is not an accurate description of the situation at all. They don't have a map. They simply don't. And one of the real problems is that there are enormous differences within the UK government itself. So in the chamber of horrors that is the UK government, David Davis is by no means, you know, in my experience, in the worst in the worst chamber. There are people with even more fixed and rigid and views than you will get if you talk to the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. But he is on a spectrum in a range of views. That means that the reason why we don't have information, the reason we don't have coherence, and the reason we don't get agendas and papers and everything like that, is that they cannot agree amongst themselves as to what those positions and those papers should say. And the Prime Minister made an attempt to try and craft a position on Brexit that she believed that she could make hold inside her own party. And so much of this has always been about putting the interests of the Conservative Party ahead of the interests of the rest of the country. So she tried to put a position which, you know, she thought she could weld onto her party. She's not in that position at all now. And if you try to be optimistic, you might say that that has opened up possibilities for different ways of doing things and crafting an exit map that will be less damaging than it would have been otherwise. Will it happen at all? Well, John Kerr, who is on your advisory group here and who wrote Article 50, his view is that the member state that triggered Article 50 can say, we're taking it off the table at any point in the process that you chose to do so. But the problem here is that this is a two-way street, and it is not in the hands of the United Kingdom alone to try and reverse the process. And we will have damaged our standing and our reputation and our relationship so badly with so many other people that if we did reach a point where we thought, oh, we made a terrible mistake and we want to try and put the train into reverse, we shouldn't simply assume that the people that we've done all this damage to will simply say, oh, fine, carry on then, you know, we'll carry on as before. So the more this goes on, the more corrosive that becomes, and the more difficult it will become. Where is the locus in terms of trying to have that impact? Well, look, I think it's quite important for me to say that if I want the UK government to respect the devolution competencies and not to try to take things away from our responsibilities and act as though they were responsible, then it's quite important sometimes for the Welsh government not to try and pretend that we are in their position either. And there are some UK government responsibilities here. They have the locus, I believe, primarily to attend to that complex mix of interests that have to be represented in Brexit. And while we can advise them and we can try and make sure they understand where the priorities might lie from our perspectives, we shouldn't attempt to put ourselves in their position either. It both absolves them of responsibilities that they ought to be willing to discharge, but it also invites them then to trespass into things that we believe are properly ours to discharge.
Okay, great. Francis, any
very briefly, Mark,
comments?
because Mark actually made the point I really wanted to make, which was that Article 50, not only Lord Kerr, but I think most lawyers think that there is no reason why it shouldn't be, it couldn't be withdrawn if the UK wanted to. But of course, it's a political decision. It is also, as Mark said, it's not cost-free. I mean, I actually think that the majority of EU countries, depends how it was done, would be very pleased in the end. But there has been huge reputational damage anyway to the UK as a result of this whole process. So it's not cost-free. The only other thing was after the Brexit vote, there was a lot of talk of contagion of this, but the Eurosceptics, who are definitely there in a number of other countries, would be pushing for similar referendums. But it's quite striking. Just last week in Dublin, there was the Finnish foreign minister, famous Eurosceptic Timo Soini, and he said, well, one thing which is absolutely clear, and that is that what the chaos in the UK after the Brexit referendum has certainly discouraged most other European countries from going the same route, at least in the medium term.
Katie? No? I do have just one sort of additional question. I mean, in terms of this route back, I don't know if you'd have a comment, and otherwise I'll put it to Catherine, is Article 50 doesn't say anything about a route back. And of course, I'm not a lawyer, but some lawyers have said that means, therefore, you can have a route back. The European Parliament, in its resolution, said all the 27 EU member states should agree with that. The Commission has now said that too. Now, that's not in Article 50. Katie, the politics of this, if it happened, do you think it would be tricky?
Yes, I'd say that'd be an understatement. I don't pass it to Catherine.
Okay, I mean, Catherine, what is going on in the politics of that the Parliament and Commission is saying that? They're saying we can change our minds, but they seem to be putting up quite a high bar at one level.
Well, I think initially people are very sympathetic for those of us who wanted to remain. Lots of sympathy. A year on just now, I think it's disbelief that we just don't seem to have a plan and that we are behaving the way that we're behaving. The rhetoric, because people read our papers. Watch the BBC. They look at what we are saying and what we're doing in ways we don't look at what's happening in Le Monde or the Süddeutsche Zeitung, or and they're looking at us thinking in disbelief. Are you really going to do this to yourself? Do you know the damage you're going to do to yourself by doing this? And it's with a real disbelief that they look at it. I think that I think you're right, Mark. That even if we come to a stage where the pain is too much and we decide that actually this is a big mistake, the damage that has been done to us, we are doing to ourselves, is one which I think is quite something we again need to reflect upon. But just now, I just think there's a bit of, well, it's your problem, get on with it. You've created it, get on with it. And that's why, there's all of this discussion going on in other aspects of the EU budget, what's going to happen, say, in the future research programme, what's going on in other areas of EU policy. That's all going on. It's your problem, you've created it, this is what you wanted, the clock is ticking, come to us and negotiate.
Right. We're running out of time, but I know some people have been waiting patiently, so I'm going to take a last 2 or 3 questions from people who haven't spoken already, starting with the gentleman there, but could you keep them very, very short and to the point?
Yeah, hi, I'm Patrick Utz from the University of Edinburgh, and I wanted to ask, related to the deal between the Conservative Party and the DUP, which has understandably been criticised for various reasons. Is there anything that this Northern Irish perspective that is now probably better heard in Westminster, does this bring any advantage to the negotiations around the Irish border and perhaps to the negotiations around devolution in Northern Ireland in general?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And then at the front, please.
Anne Packard, you referred to the question of discussion with Gibraltar before discussion with the devolved nations. And in much of what you've been talking about, I would like to know whether there's any take at all, or whether there could be civic appetite for real, a civic voice, not locus for older people, locus for younger people, But I think there is such deep disquiet that somehow this government must somehow be taught to listen, with all that that implies. It's not only a political decision, it's an economic issue. I mean, Barnier talks about the clock ticking. It's a time bomb for self-destruction, and the sooner we get to grips with it, the better.
Okay, thank you. We're going to squeeze in Bill, and if you keep it very short, we'll also squeeze the lady in at the back, and then I'm going to have to guillotine it. Thank you.
Thank you. Just quickly, I asked the very question about revoking the Article 50, sorry, Bill Roger, European Movement in Scotland, revoking Article 50 of the Irish ambassador just last week, and his answer was, I'm sure a way would be found. I asked the same question of Elmer Brock probably about 3-4 weeks ago, and more or less the same answer from Elmer Brock. So, I mean, it does seem, I just wanted to inject that bit of optimism there. But my own question was
can
actually...
you be quick if you're also making a comment and a question?
My own question was really, it's been a hallmark of all of this that people, the individual circumstances of millions of people have actually been neglected, and the focus has been largely on EU nationals living in the UK. At this stage of the game, UK
Bill,
citizens
can you ask a question, because we're really out of
UK
time.
Citizens not living outside of the UK are going to be affected equally profoundly.
Question mark.
Is this what we need to focus on?
Okay.
And if that's the case, I'd like to invite you to sign this petition.
All right, there's a petition for afterwards. I'm going to, a woman at the back, but a very short question, please. And then I'm going to ask the panel to pick one question each and take 1 minute.
Taking everything that we've talked about and heard about and read about in the newspapers into consideration, the lack of transparency, the desire of Theresa May to leave the Human Rights Convention, to bust us out of Euratom, you know, despite the consequences. Mutterings in the press this morning about something referred to as the Henry VIII clauses, and this Article 9 of this repeal bill, which basically gives UK ministers carte blanche to do what they want.
Come to the question, because we're
does
running
it
out
seem
of time.
Does it seem to others, or is it just me, that the UK government simply wants to operate with no oversight, period, from anybody, anywhere, not just the EU?
Okay, it's a great question. Sorry we're running out of time, but great that this has provoked so many questions. I'm going to ask our panel to be very disciplined, pick one point and take up to 1 minute to answer it. And I'm going to start with Katie and come down the panel in that order. Katie.
Okay, so in response to Patrick's question, the DUP deal, no, it doesn't help the negotiations in Stormont at all. It's increased distrust between the parties, not just between Sinn Féin and the DUP, but indeed other parties in the DUP. And also it's de-incentivised the DUP for finding a deal and restoring devolution. And in relation to the possible Brexit outcomes as a result of the DUP deal with the Tory party, the DUP agree wholeheartedly with the Tory party approach to Brexit, with one minor issue related to immigration. And the Tory party and the DUP say they want to avoid a hard border, but neither of them are clear about how that's going to happen and what they mean by a hard border. I'm going to try and finish on a positive note, which is very difficult for me to do these days. And that is, if in the unlikely scenario that we do have a flexible and imaginative solution for the Irish border that's agreed in the Brexit negotiations, that involves recognition of the Good Friday Agreement in a way that complicates and recognises the complexity of relations between these islands and North and South. Then the Tory party bring that back to the House of Commons, and the DUP is committed to accepting that and to voting in favour of it. So that may be a very roundabout and unlikely way that there could be some advantage of the DUP deal for the Brexit outcome for Northern Ireland.
Francis, your one question.
I suppose the obvious thing that there should be balance between the EU citizens' rights in the UK and UK citizens in Europe, and that's obviously been strongly emphasised in the EU position, and at the moment there's controversy as to whether the UK offer is adequate or not, and probably Catherine will want to comment on that. It is, though, firstly, there are more EU citizens in the UK and vice versa, and UK citizens in the EU are disproportionately in Spain. So it's a particularly acute problem, Spain. And Spain's health system has been majorly affected by having all these British citizens. So that'll be a particularly interesting bilateral one. The only other thing I wanted to make from an earlier point made by Catherine was on the EEA, because in the border between Ireland and the UK, obviously the most affected products are going to be agricultural products,
that's right.
and that is not going to be helped even by an EEA deal. I mean, the percentage of agricultural products in the trade, people, Irish beef farmers massively affected, producers of Irish cheese massively affected. And I think that point really needs, even the good EEA solution has lacuna for Irish relations.
And there's 200 farms across borders, is that not right? There's something statistic like there's 200.
A large number anyway. Mark, your last
So
brief thoughts.
I'll do Citizens' Voice and say that the upside of uncertainty and the plurality of views in the UK government means that the general election means that if ever there was a time for citizens' voices to be heard and for a movement to try to be organised that can influence and strengthen some of the more sensible voices and marginalise some of the less ones. So this is the moment to do it.
Okay. Clear and wonderfully brief. Alistair.
You first.
So can I talk?
No, I was going in order down the table.
The question was asked about, does the UK government behave as if it was wanting no oversight? Well, I think, yes, it's behaving that way because that's probably the way that we'd ideally like to operate. Henry VIII thankfully never got to run Scotland, so I'm not sure I can make direct comparisons, but certainly Henry VIII-style executive powers over any area of legislation are unwelcome. But the attempt to essentially have the UK government legislating in areas which are devolved is utterly unacceptable and will not be accepted by the Scottish Parliament or the Scottish Government.
Catherine.
So I think there should be a citizens first approach. I think we should have solved the citizens issue way, last year at the, when we, why we're here, I don't know. So I agree that citizens first, and we should be able to protect citizens' rights both abroad and here. I think on the Henry VIII clause issue, isn't it interesting that we're talking about Henry VIII and it's 2017? I think that Parliament needs to scrutinise what is happening, and I think it's really that we have a devolved settlement in Wales, in Northern Ireland and in Scotland that should be recognised, and the devolved nations should have a say.
Excellent. Well, I'm not going to try and conclude. I just want to say personally, I thought this was a fascinating discussion. I think, it encompasses so much, but I think, and I hope you agree, that we've managed to go down a number of levels of detail, both very much thanks to our panel, but also thanks to you, the audience, for listening, for staying, for asking so many different questions from so many points of view. So my thanks once again to the European Parliament in Scotland for organising this wonderful event. To all our panellists, thank you so much for your contributions.